Hi. A request is when you ask someone, would you please do X for me by time Y? If they say yes to your request, then they have given you a commitment. When someone breaks a commitment to you, you find out about it when they've broken the commitment, but the real breakdown usually happens much earlier. It happens at the time you make the request. So by learning the best practice of how to make requests, you're much more likely to have people deliver on the commitments that they made to you. There's 7 elements to a complete request. Let's cover them one by one. The first one is to make an explicit request. You see, there's a difference between someone breaking a commitment to you and someone not living up to your expectations. If you ask someone explicitly to do something and they say yes, but then they don't do it, then they have a broken commitment. But if you haven't had an explicit conversation with them, then they're not breaking any agreements. And quite often we get angry at people when they don't act as per our expectations, as if they've broken an agreement, but these are two completely different things. The biggest reason that people give for not having explicit agreements is, I shouldn't have to explain this. They should know this. But you're setting yourself up for disappointment and frustration. So translate your unarticulated expectations into explicit agreements. The second element of a request is to have an open listener. If you make a request when somebody is distracted or upset, or if you send a message to someone and simply assume they got the message, well, you don't even know if they heard or absorbed your request. And the biggest way to get an open listener is to hear them out so that they feel they've been understood. Only then will they be open to hearing what you have to say. If you simply order people to do things and say, I don't want to hear it, to their concerns or counterpoints, then you may not have buy-in. And if you feel like someone is not listening to you, it's probably because they feel you haven't understood them. Instead of explaining yourself more assertively or repeating yourself, you need to stop, listen to them. And only after you've understood them are they going to be open to listening to you. The third element of a request is context. Why is your request important? If you say to someone, could you please send the report by Thursday? Then sure, you made the request, but there's no context. But if you said, could you please send the report by Thursday 5 p.m.? I have a meeting with a client next morning at 10 a.m. and I want to download the report before I leave office so I can read it on the flight there. Well, now they understand why it's important that you need it by that time. You're much less likely to have them break that commitment. The fourth element of request is that it should be unambiguous. Saying to an experienced subordinate, could you please clean up the presentation before you send it to the client, may be completely fine. But for a less experienced team member, you might need to be more specific. Could you please make sure that we're using the same font and consistent font size on each slide, run a spell check, replace all the cartoons with high definition pictures instead. Now that's clear. The next element of a request is to check understanding. There's some managers who complain that their teams don't deliver even though that they have explained clearly what they wanted. And I have to ask them, clear to whom? It might be clear to them, but it's clearly not clear to their team member. Now, clearly, if you ever say to your team member, this is not what I was expecting, it's not their fault. It's your responsibility. It's your responsibility to check if they've understood. And one of the ways of doing that is to ask more open questions. So rather than simply saying, do A, then do B, then do C, ask them, talk me through how you're planning to execute this and what are the major challenges you feel you need to watch out for. And if you really listen, then you'll get a much better understanding of the areas they're clear on, the areas they're not clear on. The next element of a request is a deadline. If there's no deadline, then it's not a request, because people can always say to you, I was just about to do it, and they have not broken any commitment. So you can't hold them accountable. Lots of managers say things like, this is really urgent, or we need to do this ASAP. But we have an execution motto at Stillwater. There is never any urgency. There is never any urgency, but there is always a deadline. You see, just calling lots of things urgent creates pressure without clarity. But when there are clear deadlines, then people can prioritize and plan their schedules accordingly, and they become more productive. When you give a deadline, then the understanding is you don't follow up every few hours asking, is it done yet? Is it done yet? How long will it take? It's their job to get it done by the deadline. You just get on with your work. That's what it means to trust and delegate. Now, if they have not done the task by the deadline they have committed, well, that's a separate conversation, and we have a separate video on how to hold people accountable to cover that. And the final element of a complete request is that the person you're making the request of has the freedom to say no to the request. If they can't say no, then it's not a genuine request. It's an order, a demand, or a threat. So if you ask someone to complete a report by the weekend and they say it won't be possible, and you say, I don't want to hear any excuses, you have to get it done. And they might say, I'll try, I'll do my best, which if you really listen to it carefully is not really a commitment, right? And if they don't then give you the report by the weekend, you might say you broke your commitment. But technically they didn't. They didn't give you a commitment, you effectively made the commitment on their behalf. And you can force somebody to say yes, but getting someone to say yes is different from getting a commitment. A commitment is when someone says yes to a request when they have the permission to say no. And if you don't give the permission to say no, by threatening them or making them feel guilty or by begging them, well, then you can never really rely on the yes, because what else could they have said? But if you said, hey, I really need this report on the weekend, but if you can't get it done, let me know right now so that I can communicate to my stakeholders. And then if they say yes, they can, and you say, are you sure? And they say, yes, I can get it done. Well, then it's a commitment. Just to be clear, a commitment is not the same thing as a target. A target is an aspirational number that you're aiming for. Sometimes when someone doesn't achieve a target, you may be tempted to accuse them of breaking a commitment and subtly insinuate that they lack integrity, to get them to feel guilt and shame so they work harder. And that may be for some people a genuine misunderstanding of the distinction between a commitment and a target. But if people know the difference and they pretend not to, then it's a manipulative conversation. These are the 7 elements of a complete request. And not all of them are relevant to every single request. But if someone breaks a commitment to you, you might want to audit which one of these you might have missed out on. Now, you're unlikely to remember all 7 elements, sure. But all of us have different personalities. So the way to create value from this video is to ask yourself, given what you know of your own personality, you probably do 5 or 6 of these perfectly. Which element of a complete request do you think you're most likely to miss out on? And which is the next situation where you'd consciously like to ensure that you include it in your requests?